You were taught that Rome brought civilization, that its legions brought order, its law brought justice, and its empire lifted the world from darkness. But buried beneath the marble and myth is a truth too ugly for statues. Rome did not conquer with glory, it conquered with terror. The blood spilled was not just of soldiers, but of entire cultures. What you were taught was a victory parade. What was hidden was a crime scene. These are the war crimes Rome committed and then buried in silence. They called it a triumph, a sacred parade for victorious generals, where chariots rolled through the heart of the city, and the people of Rome roared as spoils from distant lands were dragged before them: golden idols, exotic animals, rare silks, even chained kings. But what the crowds never spoke of were the others, the women with their veils torn away, the children who had marched barefoot for weeks, the priests beaten into silence, the elders who stumbled and were whipped until they collapsed. Rome's triumphs were not the end of war, but the beginning of silence. No one dared ask what would happen to the captives once the celebration ended. They were not counted. They were not named. They were property now, absorbed into the empire's endless hunger, fed to mines, brothels, fields, and furnaces. Some were paraded only to be executed at the end of the procession, their blood spilled as part of the spectacle. Others were sold immediately, stripped of everything but their ability to labor or entertain. The Roman public watched, applauded, and then returned home to write poems about glory. No one recorded the screams. No one remembered the ones who marched in chains. But the stone streets of Rome remember. In the cracks, under the wheels of the chariots, blood once pooled. They washed it away before the next victory. And with every triumph, Rome buried one more piece of the truth that civilization did not arrive through wisdom, but through conquest, rape, and fire. The silence beneath the triumph is not ancient, it is deliberate, and it still echoes. They came under a white flag. The people of Avaricum had heard what the Romans did to those who resisted. Entire towns turned to ash, bodies crucified along roads, children stolen in the night. So they opened their gates, they laid down weapons, they offered bread, salt, and surrender. Julius Caesar accepted in writing. He praised their good sense, promised protection. His legions entered not as conquerors, but as guests. And then, the killing began. The gates were sealed behind them. The Romans moved house by house, sword by sword, torch by torch. The people who had surrendered were cut down where they stood, some with blades, some with fire, some buried alive in cellars where they had tried to hide their children. Caesar wrote that over 40,000 were killed. He did not call it a massacre, he called it a message. Avaricum was not the only Gallic city. It was one of the richest, one of the proudest, one that still believed Rome could be bargained with. Its destruction was not an act of rage, it was policy. Roman soldiers took food, gold, and anything else they pleased, but they took time with the people. Women were dragged to temples and raped beneath broken gods. Children were thrown from balconies. Old men were made to kneel and then stabbed slowly, as examples. Survivors were not left behind, there were none. The air stank of blood and burnt cloth for days after. Caesar said it was unfortunate, but necessary. His letters to the Senate were cold, efficient, no remorse, just a reminder that fear builds faster than trust. He knew the massacre at Avaricum would echo, and it did. Other Gallic towns fought harder, ran farther, or most often simply vanished before the Romans arrived. In Roman classrooms, Avaricum is studied as a military success. Strategic, brilliant, a hard but wise lesson in total war. But if you walk the land today, the soil still turns dark in spring. No bones remain, they were burned or scattered, but the earth remembers. And the wind still whispers something hollow where the voices of 40,000 once lived. Rome did not just burn cities, it burned trust. It taught entire nations that peace was a lie, mercy a trap, and surrender a slow death dressed in ceremony. This was not war, it was extermination, and it was applauded. They were small, that was the first thing the Roman merchants noticed. Small, pale, and quiet. Children taken from the highlands and low valleys of Britannia, places with names the empire would never bother to remember. After the legions crushed the hill forts, After the last of the warriors bled out in bracken and mud, the real conquest began, not of land but of bodies. Rome took children like cattle. They were shackled in pairs, some still bleeding from beatings, others too young to walk without help. Mothers who clung to them were whipped or speared. Infants were thrown into carts like sacks. Older boys, if strong, were taken for labor. Smaller ones, prettier ones, were sold for things Rome would never carve into stone. The journey south was slow, deliberate, brutal. Some died along the roads, their feet too blistered or their ribs too broken. The soldiers did not stop. They left the bodies for wolves or buried them under shallow rock piles. Survivors were marched to ships and taken across the channel, where Latin words they didn't understand would decide their fate. In the markets of Gaul, Hispania, and Rome itself, Britannia's children were exotic stock, wild, pale, unbroken. Buyers paid more for those who didn't cry. Some were forced into Roman households as curiosities. Others were trained to perform in blood sport or used to satisfy darker appetites. There were no laws to protect them. They had no names anymore, only prices. Some Roman poets even wrote about them, calling them islands of innocence tamed by steel. But nothing was innocent about how they were taken. Rome called it civilization, called it taming the savage. But the children remembered the screams, the smoke, the way their homes disappeared in flame, the way the sky looked when everything they loved turned to ash. No classroom teaches their stories. No monument bears their faces. But if you go to the northern cliffs where the wind never stops and the rocks remember footsteps long gone, some say you can still hear a sound not quite animal, not quite human, a kind of weeping that has no language, only memory. Rome did not just steal childhood, it made a business of it, and the broken children of Britannia were not the only ones. They were just among the first to be forgotten. The fires of Carthage burned for 17 days. When the last tower collapsed into flame and the once mighty city fell silent, the Roman soldiers were given one final order: take the women, not save, not spare. Take. Carthage had been Rome's rival for over a century, its equal in ambition, wealth, and pride. But when it fell in 146th year before Christ, it was not merely defeated, it was humiliated, and its women bore the weight of that revenge. They were dragged from temples and homes, barefoot through ash and bone, their fine robes torn from them, their jewelry ripped from ears and wrists. Priestesses were seized from the altars of Tanit and Baal Hamon, stripped naked before Roman generals who mocked their foreign gods and ordered them defiled at the foot of their sanctuaries. Girls too young to understand what was happening were separated from their mothers. Some were auctioned in the ruins, sold to soldiers still drunk on blood. Others were marched across the sea in chains to Rome, where they were paraded as trophies not for who they were, but for what they had once belonged to. Carthaginian women were famed for their intellect, their beauty, their strength. Rome saw this and decided none of it would be spared. Even noble women, wives of Carthaginian senators and generals, were treated not as prisoners of war but as prizes of humiliation. Some were forced to perform rituals of surrender while naked, bowing before statues of Roman gods. Others were made to carry the ashes of their husbands in urns across Roman streets, while jeering crowds pelted them with fruit and spit. No treaty was ever offered, no peace. This was not strategy, it was punishment, generational, cultural, and deliberate. By the time the city was reduced to rubble, salt was poured into the earth so nothing could grow again. But the deeper erasure happened not in the soil, but in the womb. The Romans knew, if you desecrate the women, you kill the future. Carthaginian bloodlines were broken not by sword but by seed. The daughters of the empire that had once terrified Rome were forced to bear Roman children, a generation born not of love but of domination. And when those children cried, they did so in Latin, not Punic. No school teaches this, no monument honors them. But if you dig beneath the layers of marble and pride, beneath the Roman villas built from stolen stone, you will find silence where a civilization once stood, and the ghosts of women who were never given the right to scream. Judea did not fall quietly. Rome expected another province to bow, but what it found was a people who would rather die with dignity than live in chains. And so Rome answered with fire. It began with the siege of Jerusalem, not a battle, but a starvation. Roman legions encircled the city, cutting off water, grain, even salt. They waited as children grew thin and fevered, as mothers scraped walls for mold to feed them, as men turned on each other in hunger-maddened rage. Some historians say over 100,000 died before the gates were even breached. But Rome did not stop there. When the walls finally crumbled, the soldiers poured in like a flood, and with them came a violence that had nothing to do with victory. Temples were looted and set alight, their priests hacked down at the altar. Women were dragged by the hair into the streets. The old were slaughtered where they knelt. Children were speared in their mothers' arms. The Second Temple, the heart of Jewish faith and identity, was burned before their eyes. Some say the gold from its walls melted and flowed into the cracks between the stones, and that the Romans tore those stones apart to claim it. Others say the screams were so loud, the earth itself seemed to tremble. After Jerusalem, Rome scoured the hills and villages of Judea like a plague. Any town that resisted was reduced to cinders. Crops were destroyed, wells poisoned, trees felled so nothing could grow again. Entire communities were crucified not for rebellion, but as reminders. Roads were lined with thousands of crosses. Each held a body, many of them boys no older than 14. Their crime was being borne under a flag Rome could not control. Those who survived were marched away in chains. Judean scholars, rabbis, poets, all were silenced. Rome made sure of it. Libraries were burned, sacred scrolls unrolled and trampled, names erased. The aim was not just submission, it was deletion. A land that once echoed with prayer and law and story was left mute, the soil soaked in blood, the wind heavy with ash. Rome would later call it pacification. They would coin a phrase for it, desert they make, and call it peace. But those who lived through it, those whose descendants still place stones on shattered graves, know the truth. Judea was not conquered, it was cauterized. A people were made to watch their world end in slow motion, and when the last fire went out, the silence left behind was not peace, it was grief with nowhere left to go. They called it siege warfare, but what Rome truly mastered was starvation. Not the quick kind, the slow unraveling of a human being, a death by days, not by blades. In places like Numantia, in the rugged heart of Hispania, Rome surrounded entire cities and simply waited. The people inside had livestock, grain stores, wells, but not enough. Not against time. Rome turned hunger into strategy. They built walls around cities to cage the living. They watched from hillsides as smoke rose thinner each day. They intercepted any who tried to flee. No food came in. No mercy either. Inside the walls, panic grew teeth. Families rationed seeds. Leather was boiled, chewed, swallowed. Dogs disappeared. Then cats. Then rats. Eventually, people began digging in the dirt for roots and insects. Some boiled belts, shoes, parchment. And when even that failed, they turned to the last thing left, each other. Roman records gloss over it, but fragments of survivor testimony speak of what they saw: mothers hiding the bodies of their dead children to feed smaller ones, neighbors disappearing after visiting a home for dinner, bones cracked open for marrow, flesh dried in strips, not from cruelty, from desperation so deep it overrode humanity. Rome knew this, counted on it. They called it psychological war. The survivors who surrendered were shadows, emaciated, sunken-eyed, barely breathing. Some tried to bite their captors, some no longer spoke at all. They were herded into camps, enslaved, or executed. The city of Numantia was razed, not just the buildings, the people, the memory, the name. Rome left no shrine, no plaque, only silence. This tactic repeated across provinces: Dacia, Gaul, Judea. Whenever resistance flared, Rome responded with patience sharpened into cruelty. Why lose soldiers to swords when hunger is a sharper blade? Siege became theater. Hunger, the main actor, and the audience, the Roman Senate, the public applauded. Grain from these conquered lands later filled Roman storehouses. While the children of those cities withered, Rome fed its own on the bones of the defeated. And yet, in schools today, Siege is taught as brilliant engineering, as tactical genius. Rarely does anyone speak of the cries echoing in empty streets, of the mothers digging graves with bare hands, too weak to scream. Rome called it discipline. The survivors called it a curse. But the dead? They called nothing. They were starved into silence. In Rome, death was not only punishment, it was performance. Execution became art, and suffering became applause. The Colosseum was the most famous stage, but it was not the only one. Across the empire, from dusty provinces to marble forums, Rome made a spectacle of cruelty. The condemned were not merely killed, they were broken, choreographed, and displayed. Some were made to dress as mythological figures, Icarus, Orpheus, Hercules, then slaughtered in scripted scenes for cheering crowds. Others were sewn into the skins of animals and mauled by lions trained to wait for the perfect moment. There were men set on fire to light banquets, women crucified in rows along parade routes, children fed to beasts while musicians played. These were not criminals. Often they were prisoners of war, slaves, political dissenters, or simply poor. Their deaths were entertainment, and the more novel, the better. One recorded execution forced a man to act out a play, a comedic farce, knowing he would be killed in the final act. Another involved tying a woman to a slowly turning wheel, her body breaking as the audience placed bets on which limb would snap first. The crowds came hungry not for bread, but for blood. Senators, scholars, even poets attended. They laughed, they clapped, they brought their children. Some wrote verses about the beauty of a well-timed death scream. Execution became an industry. Gladiator schools trained men not just to fight, but to die with flair. Managers taught them how to stagger, how to gasp, how to fall in a way that drew more cheers. It was not about justice, it was about control. Rome knew that the public could be kept loyal if their hunger for dominance was fed. Watching someone lesser suffer reminded them of their place in the hierarchy above the chained, above the begging, above the dying. And yet the line between spectator and victim was thin. A misplaced word, an unpaid debt, a wrong association, and one could go from seat to stage in a day. That fear kept people quiet, obedient. Rome perfected this balance between awe and terror, between beauty and horror, between order and rot. The executions were not excesses, they were instruments, not accidents, intentions. The empire did not just kill people. It taught others how to enjoy it, and that legacy, once planted, does not die easily, because cruelty, when normalized, becomes tradition, and when tradition is soaked in blood, even the innocent learn to cheer. Rome was built on memory, on statues carved, victories etched in stone, names immortalized in marble, but what they remembered was only half the story. The rest was erased. Not by accident, by design. For every monument that still stands, there is a silence beneath it, a truth too dangerous to be recorded. The empire's greatest power was not its legions or its laws, it was its ability to decide what would be forgotten. When cities were sacked, Rome didn't just destroy buildings, it destroyed language. Scrolls were burned, temples defaced. Names of gods, kings, and cultures were scratched out from records so completely that today we have no words to even describe them. In Carthage, entire libraries were turned to ash. In Judea, sacred texts were seized, then vanished. In Gaul, oral traditions were severed by the slaughter of Druids. Those who remembered the old ways were crucified, buried alive, or sold into silence. Even within Rome, erasure was a political tool. Emperors removed rivals from history by chiseling out their faces from coins, painting over them in frescoes, recarving their names on tombs. The practice had a name, damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. To Rome, being forgotten was a punishment worse than death. And it worked. Generations later, people believed what Rome told them, that the empire was a force of light in a dark world, that its conquests were liberation, that its victims were savages who deserved no record. The cruelty was airbrushed, the atrocities softened into legend, the massacres became military strategy, the slavery became economics, the rapes were not mentioned at all, but the silence was never total. in bones dug up from forgotten graves, in letters hidden beneath floorboards, in ruins once thought meaningless, the erased still speak. Their stories do not fit neatly into textbooks. They disturb, they accuse, they remind us that history is not just what survives, it is what was allowed to survive. Rome's darkest crimes were not just committed in blood, but in ink or the lack of it. The empire ended, but its version of events lived on, because it was written, because it was taught, and because we were never supposed to question it. But now, we must, not to rewrite history, but to unbury it, to say the names that were taken, to light candles where Rome built shadows, and to finally remember what they tried so hard to make us forget. If you believe the past has voices worth hearing, even the ones silenced by empires, then like, subscribe, and follow Forgotten Stories' Ancient World. Hit the bell, and don't miss the next history that was never meant to be found.